Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, a show on India's national broadcaster Doordarshan about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and global and regional developments that are of significance to India's rise. Viewers, in this episode, we are doing a deep dive into a phenomenon that is bound to reshape the international order, at least for the next 4 years. This is the second coming of Donald Trump as President of the United States. What will be Trump 2.0's foreign policy outlook? Can we expect something different this time or more of the same? How will different countries adjust to Trump's disruptive as well as unusual presidency? And what can we look forward to in terms of the global order as Trump is bound to make a huge impact on it? This is the theme for this episode, and to take us through this discussion, I have with me a top American scholar who is a distinguished professor of politics at Tufts University in the United States, Professor Daniel Drezner. Professor Drezner is a leading expert on American foreign policy and has written widely and is followed all over the world. And one of his books, I must mention for the audience, is actually about Trump's style of presidency. And he has actually closely studied and commented upon it. Daniel, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you for having me.
So Daniel, we have now Trump 2.0 and it's a reality. And this is causing ripple effects all over the world. Many events are kind of adjusting themselves to meet this new reality, and you see around the world a buzz about what this is going to mean. So to start with, I'd like you to please come in and weigh in on the the general question of, is this more continuity from Trump's first term, or do you see changes? I've seen you writing lately that he might be inclined to take more risks than usual than in the past, and that he may be even more radical than in his first term, because now it's about his legacy and he has no more elections to fight. And there is this whole ideological movement he represents. So whether there is a tussle between the bureaucracy, the permanent bureaucracy, and the populist bandwagon that Trump represents. So could you please start by reflecting on what you think is likely to stay the same and what might change, and what can the world expect from Trump this time around?
I think the best way to answer that is to realize that Trump's first term, Trump 1.0, was not necessarily a sort of constant foreign policy as over the 4 years. That really what happened was, during his first couple of years as president, you saw a constant internecine battle within the Trump administration between sort of his genuinely populist impulses in terms of remaking the global order and a lot of the sort of more traditional Republicans that he had no choice but to hire to serve in various cabinet positions. And so really for a couple of years, the Trump administration was almost at war with itself in terms of what it wanted to do. And it also had to deal with a Congress that was well populated with Democrats that were opposed to his agenda, as well as a fair number of Republicans that were more traditional internationalists. It was really only in the last year of Trump's presidency where he sort of finally, frankly, fired almost everyone that he disagreed with, and particularly after he lost in November in 2020, you really saw Trump's populist impulses come full flower, where he wanted to withdraw U.S. forces from Germany, from Africa, from the Middle East, and really kind of remake U.S. foreign policy completely. And I think the thing to realize is that now President Trump 2.0 faces far fewer political constraints than Trump 1.0 faced. He's not hiring the same Republicans to serve in cabinet positions. There's no more so-called adults in the room. He's not hiring any generals this time. The Republicans in Congress, which have majorities, are far more MAGA-friendly than they were 8 years ago. And the Supreme Court has ruled that Trump can pretty much do what he wants as president, and he has immunity. So he's in a situation where he faces far fewer constraints in terms of what he wants to do. And the result is going to be probably a much more widely variable foreign policy. His foreign policy could be all over the map. He's obviously going to be enjoying brinksmanship. We saw this during the transition. We are likely going to see this during his at least his first year in office. But the other thing to realize is that the 2024 election for Trump is a vindication for him of all of his foreign policy impulses, or all of his political impulses. In other words, he transgressed all sorts of norms during his first term, after he lost the election, and again during the 4-year Biden administration, in which he was charged with multiple felonies, and he has emerged on the other side as president. This is the danger in terms of Trump's ability to feel like he can probably do anything at this point and get away with it, because, to be fair, that's what his track record has been to date.
And Daniel, he could do anything, and that's of course the so-called madman theory that you've also written about with regard to Trump's foreign policy. But on the question of doing anything, I mean, could there be actually a radical swing in a different direction? Because we have always associated him with a branch of populism that is isolationist and doesn't want to engage or to do or to commit much to the world, right? And he's much happier at home than in global forums and in international institutions and in shaping the world order. But then now we've seen during the transition all this strange talk about taking over Greenland and annexing Canada and Panama and so on. So I'd like to ask you if you think that there is some kind of a wild swing possible from isolationism to some kind of neo-imperialism. I mean, it's quite unthinkable that the United States can actually go for territorial expansion and aggression. But at least he's using probably his pressure tactics through these means, through this kind of rhetoric, to force these countries to negotiate with him on his usual pet themes like economic deals and concessions, isn't it? I mean, what's your view on this, rather strange turn with Trump one more time?
My view on this is that labeling Trump as an isolationist is a category error. Trump is not an isolationist. Trump is a mercantilist who prefers to use force in the Western Hemisphere rather than anywhere else. And I think that's the way you have to understand why Trump has been talking about Greenland or the Panama Canal or Canada becoming the 51st state. To be clear, I'm pretty skeptical that you're actually going to see the use of military force, particularly in Greenland and Canada. The Panama Canal Zone is a separate story, as well as, by the way, Mexico as well. But the way that to think about Trump is that first of all, he has sort of a 19th century vision of international politics. And in the 19th century, land equaled power. And so he sees a world where if the United States exercises more territorial control, it is somehow seen as a great power. And I think another way to think about this is that, weirdly enough, he's following the footsteps of folks like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping. Putin obviously annexed Crimea and has invaded Ukraine. And in response to that, Putin's popularity within Russia, particularly in 2014, shot up dramatically. Similarly, Xi Jinping has dedicated himself to reunifying Hong Kong and Taiwan with China, again, seeing that territory matters. I think that Trump, to some extent, is following their pattern, where he thinks that if he can somehow redraw the map to enlarge the United States, that's his historical legacy. I think the other thing that's going on here, as you say, and as I wrote about the madman theory, Trump likes to, if there is nothing else that Donald Trump enjoys, it is transgressing previously accepted international norms. And the most powerful norm of the post-war international order has been the concept of territorial sovereignty, the idea that we are past the stage where the way you settle international disputes is to grab territory. But with what Russia has done in Ukraine, with what Israel has done in the Golan Heights, with what China is threatening to do with Taiwan, and India and Pakistan as well, I would add, you're seeing Trump sort of embrace the violation of this norm as an indication of, if other actors are going to do this, then that entitles the United States to do it as well. The other thing I would say about this is that if there is, Donald Trump in international politics is a classic bully, by which I mean that what bullies like to do is pick on weaker actors. Bullies like to bully people that they know they can win against. And so the United States under Trump is going to have no problem picking on Canada or picking on Denmark and Greenland or picking on Panama because the U.S. enjoys a massive asymmetric power advantage vis-a-vis those allied states. I think Trump is hopeful that that form of bullying will translate into a reputation for toughness with U.S. adversaries like Russia and China. I am deeply skeptical that that will actually be the case, but nonetheless, I am pretty sure that that's what Trump thinks is going to happen.
Right. So, viewers, it's possible that even the United States will become a revisionist power, and that's what Professor Drezner is saying. Yeah, normally we associate this with China and Russia, but even the US, maybe there's a new norm being created where the old guardrails are falling apart. Daniel, you already mentioned the adversaries, and let's go to China. I mean, that's the number one great power rival of the United States. And Trump, in fact, during his first term, his administration was the first one to highlight that great power competition is back and that the United States should reorient away from counterterrorism and non-state threats and such things and go back to conventional geopolitics and counterbalancing and pushing back of adversaries. So, but in implementation, there were many a slip between cup and lip, as the saying goes. But nonetheless, they did identify it, and ever since the US has been tightening the screws or has been much more wary of engaging with China. I was watching the outgoing US ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, saying that 80% of my time of his tenure was in competing, not in positive engagement with China. So clearly a shift has happened. What do you think that's going? I mean, I was reading Yan Zuetong, one of the well-known Chinese scholars at Tsinghua University, and he says that Trump will be a difficult customer and he's going to be aggressive, but his isolationism will help China, and his inability to build coalitions will help China, and that essentially China will look to divide the field and not ensure any kind of a large-scale counterbalancing coalition from emerging, because Trump will alienate so many of his strategic partners and allies. So do you think Trump will have a strategy at least this time around and sustain it to maintain pressure on China? And this question matters a lot to us in India and, as you know, many other US allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, because there's a bit of a uncertainty factor when it comes to Trump, because you never know when he will turn around and say Xi Jinping is my best friend and I'm going to do a deal with him.
You're exactly right. I do think, to the extent that there is a degree of unanimity within Trump's various cabinet officials this time around, it is in fact a sort of hawkish posture towards China. In some cases, this is because the likes of, let's say, Secretary of State Marco Rubio view China as the paramount threat, as you said. In other instances, where you have mercantilists who are basically extremely worried about the fact that China is running $1 trillion trade surplus and that China is eroding the U.S. industrial base. And so for that reason, they want to launch a larger trade war with China. And so in that sense, you're likely to see, at least in the first year, an extremely hawkish approach towards China. And in theory, that should include allies, whether you're talking about the Quad or whether you're talking about AUKUS or the Northeast Asian allies of Japan and South Korea. In theory, that could lead to an integrated approach to China. But as you said, first of all, Donald Trump doesn't play well with allies. He much prefers to bully them. So I'm skeptical that the coordination with allies is going to be all that successful. The other thing that I think will dominate Donald Trump's second term, and this was a replay of what we saw in Trump 1.0, is that despite all of the hawkish rhetoric, despite the trade war that was launched against China, you constantly saw Donald Trump trying to cut a sort of grand bargain with Xi Jinping. And one of the things that was very clear in the first term was that Donald Trump was willing to trade off just about every issue in return for some sort of economic deal. Donald Trump refrained from criticizing China about abuses in Xinjiang. He refused to really criticize China when it cracked down on Hong Kong. He refused to criticize China when it engaged in various exercises in the ADIZ next to Taiwan. And when a Huawei executive was arrested in Canada on charges of violations of sanctions, Trump floated the idea of returning her to China in return for a grander bargain. And so one of the things that Donald Trump thinks about himself is that he is a great deal maker. And he clearly wants to cut a deal with China. The problem is, and this goes back to his first term, is that Donald Trump is a victim of what I'd like to call glowing orb diplomacy. If you recall, Donald Trump's first overseas trip as president was to Saudi Arabia. There was that big glowing orb when the Saudis announced a sort of, new center for counterterrorism. Donald Trump was very impressed by that. He was very impressed by pageantry the first time he went to Beijing. My hunch is, and this led in the first term, in the end, to the phase one trade deal in early 2020. And indeed, he prioritized that trade deal so much that he refused to push China on the origins of COVID-19 as it was occurring, because he, generally speaking, prioritized the trade deal more. My concern in the second term is that Donald Trump will take the first offer that is given to him by the Chinese that indicates any kind of, concession that he can play up to his base and indicate that everything is worked out as he intended. So I would expect to see, an initial sort of hawkish phase where, again, Trump is trying to sort of, build up his madman credentials. The problem is that China has seen this script play out before. I suspect they will prepare a package of very shiny but not necessarily substantive concessions to him, and Donald Trump will probably take that deal. The one caveat is whether his national security cabinet will go along with that, because while Donald Trump might want to cut deals, it is not as obvious whether, let's say, Marco Rubio or Michael Waltz, who will be his national security advisor, or others will be as willing to accept such a deal.
Right. So lots of contradictions likely in the US's China policy. Daniel, you already talked about the economic deal making and his, top prioritization. He's an economic nationalist or a mercantilist, as you said. And on that point, obviously, with it's kind of indiscriminate, isn't it? Whether it is a partner or an ally or an adversary, he doesn't look at them. He first looks at what is the trade deficit with country X or country Y, right? And then he decides whether they are good or bad. So on that front, everybody is bracing for a trade war. He's spoken about 10% general tariffs. He's spoken about 60% tariffs aimed only at China, with whom they have the massive trade deficit. And then several other, figures have been in the play, and he's threatening to impose them, the moment he takes office. So, what is your reading on that aspect? And do you think countries which know the Trump playbook can somehow manage this trade war and limit the damage? There is some talk in the markets and in the business circles that it is not going to be as harsh, and that the trade war will not be as devastating as which could bring down the whole global economy, as some have feared. So that particular aspect, the transactionalism and the economic nationalism or protectionism, what do you think is going to happen with Trump on these fronts?
Well, first, Sreeram, I absolutely agree with you that Trump really views threats globally based on whether or not other actors run a trade deficit, or rather trade surplus with the United States. We have heard him during his first term say that he views the European Union as much of a threat to the United States as China or Russia. The issue with Trump and tariffs, I would say, is in terms of trade wars, is twofold. The first is that the problem when it comes to Donald Trump and tariffs is that he seems to think tariffs can do everything. And the problem is that what he wants to have them do in some ways are contradictory. So there's one argument that he is threatening tariffs with the idea that way he can extract trade concessions from other countries. And to be fair, you go all the way back to Adam Smith, and even Adam Smith endorsed that use of tariffs as a means of sort of bargaining to get other countries to lower their tariffs. The problem is that Donald Trump also believes that he can use tariffs to extract non-economic concessions, forcing allies, let's say, to contribute more in terms of their security. And then there's two other elements that when it comes to Trump and tariffs. He also views tariffs clearly as a tool of industrial policy, as a way to promote homegrown industries in the United States. And increasingly, one of the fiscal issues that's going to be coming up in the United States this coming year is that Trump desperately wants to renew the tax cuts that he put into place in 2017. But to do that, he's going to have to find alternative sources of revenue. And one of the alternative sources of revenue he is talking about is the tariffs. Now, the problem is that you can't use tariffs as a tool of industrial policy, as a tool of gaining revenue, and at the same time try to use it as a bargaining tool to get other countries to make concessions. It's got to be one or the other. And I think we still don't know, to be perfectly honest, which way Donald Trump is going to go on this. The other issue that I would say that is going to affect how Donald Trump thinks about tariffs is that I said before that he faces far fewer political constraints in his second term than he did in his first term. There is one constraint that Donald Trump is, however, going to pay attention to, and this was where things get interesting, and I would argue it's financial markets. If financial markets react badly to a serious trade war, if Trump actually were to impose a 60% tariff on Chinese imports or impose a 20% across the board tariff, I think it's safe to say markets are not going to be super keen on that. And if there is a serious market reaction, if there is a sort of Liz Truss style reaction, it would not surprise me if Trump walked back some of the tariff announcements. In other words, the one thing that he doesn't want to, the one thing that he cares about a great deal, and the one thing that he can't claim is fake news, is how the stock market and bond market reacts to his policies. If that goes badly, you might see Trump try to walk back or try to introduce massive exceptions to whatever tariffs that he's introduced.
Right. So there are still going to be some limits on Trump in his second term. Last word, Daniel. You said that under Trump, basically, America ceased being an exceptional power and just became I quote you, garden variety great power. So you have one great power, China, and then there's another one. And essentially, if there's not much of a difference in their conduct, what do you think that's going to do to the world order? And already people have written off the the liberal international order and said that it's dead. But what replaces it, especially with these two competing great powers and rising powers like India and so many others who want to catch up with the US and China? What do you see the scenario in terms of rules for the road, or is it just going to be a free-for-all? Ian Bremmer, another American political scientist, has been saying that G0 has very much arrived now, meaning there's no more any global governance or leadership whatsoever. So in terms of that effect of Trump, isn't it a more dangerous era we are going into and probably more conflict-prone? And what are your final thoughts?
I will sketch you an optimistic and a pessimistic scenario. The optimistic scenario, which I think Donald Trump actually wants to see, is essentially a great power concert. He wants a world in which the United States and China and Russia and India are great powers, and to quote Thucydides, he likes to live in a world where great powers, do what they can and weaker powers suffer what they must. And so I think that Trump ideally wants a sort of sphere of influence world where the U.S. is left alone in the Western Hemisphere, and in return, he is going to be perfectly happy to let other great powers control their neighborhoods. Now, the problem, of course, is that this doesn't really work very well for great powers outside of the United States, because India and China and Russia share some common borders, and it's not clear they can all have their same sphere of influence. The pessimistic scenario is one of the reasons that I think Trump has talked so much about Greenland and talked so much about the Panama Canal and so on and so forth, is the belief by many that a great power war is coming. And if a great power war is coming, then you need to be worried about your defense industrial base. You need to be worried about access to critical minerals. You need to make sure suddenly that you can't just rely on the market to be able to purchase things like munitions and other equipment and infrastructure. You actually have to physically control it. And where I do get concerned is that the expectation that a great power war is coming can become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. Viewers, what a intriguing conversation with Professor Daniel Drezner. One of the key points that he's made is that there are contradictions in the way Trump 2.0 is going to unfold, but at the same time there is a predictable script that Trump is going to follow. He is not brand new or an unknown category, so most countries around the world will adjust and will try to make do with this new America that we are seeing, or the return of the Trump era that we are seeing. And there's going to be a lot of upheaval, but at the same time some of the limitations and the constraints that Trump responds to are worth watching. As far as India goes, we have a comprehensive global strategic partnership with the United States, and we would want it to continue, although one word of caution from Professor Drezner is worth noting, which is that if Trump goes for a grand concert rather than a grand strategy of pushing back China, if he goes for a coexistence with China, in India we call it G2, it's an old specter. If it comes back, then we will have to rethink our approach to China as well as to the region, because the reliability of the US comes under cloud. Nonetheless, it's going to be very interesting, not a single dull day for the next 4 years. Viewers, let's closely follow Donald Trump as he makes and remakes history. Thank you, Professor Drezner. Much appreciate your time and your presence with us.
Thank you.
That's all, viewers. Let's all enjoy Trump 2.0. It's going to be a bumpy ride. It's going to be exciting. And of course, news making day in and day out. Not a dull moment, but India will need to put out all its smarts to manage these coming 4 years. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.